off.
The year is 358 BC, along the rugged Macedonian shoreline of northern Greece. A young storyteller named Iolaus of Athens finds himself surrounded by ruthless pirates after being taken captive at sea. Knowing he has little chance of escaping by force, he tries something else instead. He begins spinning the tale of the greatest warrior the world has ever known, his uncle, Hercules. According to Iolaus, Hercules was born from two worlds. His father was Zeus himself, ruler of Olympus, while his mother, Alcmene, was mortal. That forbidden union enraged Hera, queen of the gods, who saw the child as a humiliation she could never forgive. From the moment Hercules was born, she sought to destroy him. But the boy inherited the overwhelming strength of Zeus, growing into a man who seemed impossible to kill. When he came of age, the gods forced him to complete the legendary 12 labors. Only by surviving every impossible challenge would Hera finally stop hunting him. Iolaus dramatically describes battles against terrifying creatures: the monstrous Hydra, the savage Erymanthian boar, and the unstoppable Nemean lion, whose hide no blade could pierce. In the end, Hercules defeated the beast with nothing but his own bare hands. The pirates listening to the story are far from convinced. To them, it sounds like drunken fantasy. They laugh at Iolaus and mock every word coming out of his mouth, but then the mood changes instantly. A massive figure suddenly appears, wearing the skin of a lion over his shoulders. Hercules has arrived. The pirates still refuse to panic. After all, there are dozens of them. 40 armed men against a single warrior doesn't seem like a fair fight. What they fail to realize is that Hercules never fights alone. Standing beside him are the deadly companions who have traveled with him across countless battlefields. There's Amphiaraus of Argos, a mysterious seer obsessed with visions of fate. Autolycus of Sparta, a cunning thief with quick hands and an even quicker mouth. Tydeus of Thebes, a savage fighter barely able to contain his bloodlust. And finally Atalanta of Scythia, a fearless Amazon archer whose precision borders on supernatural. The pirates are completely overwhelmed. The mercenary band tears through them effortlessly, rescuing Iolaus and leaving the shoreline littered with bodies. Once the battle is over, Autolycus casually counts the severed heads they can collect payment for and jokes that Iolaus needs to make Hercules sound even more unbelievable if he wants people to fear him properly. Nearby, Amphiaraus stares deeply into a fire as strange visions consume him. In the dancing flames, he sees symbols, a lion and a crow united together, marching through a battlefield drowned in corpses. Sometime later, the group celebrates their victory inside a crowded tavern. Wine flows freely while music echoes through the hall. During the festivities, Hercules quietly confides in Autolycus that he's tired of endless fighting. He dreams of leaving everything behind and sailing far beyond known lands in search of peace. The only companion he would bring is Tydeus, since Hercules believes he's the only person capable of keeping the unstable warrior under control. Their conversation is suddenly interrupted when the entire tavern falls silent. A heavily armed group of soldiers enters the building. At their center stands Princess Erginia of Thrace. Calm but commanding, she approaches Hercules directly and invites him and his companions to the royal palace. Her father wishes to make them an offer, one that comes with an enormous reward in gold. As the soldiers move through the tavern, Iolaus notices something unusual. The emblem on their shields is a raven. Hercules, meanwhile, has always been represented by the lion. The image instantly reminds him of Amphiaraus' prophecy, the lion and the crow. When the group reaches the palace, Hercules notices the grim reality surrounding the kingdom. Behind the walls stand countless refugees, exhausted families fleeing violence and destruction. Their faces reveal a nation already collapsing under the weight of war. Inside, they are greeted by General Siticles, commander of the Thracian army, whose cold attitude makes it obvious he does not trust mercenaries. Alongside him is young Areus, Erginia's son, who immediately becomes excited upon meeting Hercules. The boy idolizes him and eagerly repeats stories of his legendary deeds. As they walk deeper into the palace, Hercules is struck by painful memories from 3 years earlier. He recalls the famous battle against the Hydra. In reality, the monster had simply been a group of armored men wearing reptile-like helmets. After the victory, King Eurystheus publicly celebrated Hercules before enormous crowds chanting his name like a god. But the memory quickly darkens. Sudden flashes of his murdered wife and children invade his mind. Blood, screams, death. Hercules forces the images away and returns his focus to the present. Soon, the mercenaries are brought before Lord Codes, king of Thrace. The ruler immediately begins testing them with insults and mockery. He taunts Amphiaraus for claiming to see the future while being unable to avoid his own death. Then he dismisses Atalanta based purely on the fact that she is a woman. She responds without hesitation. In one smooth motion, she fires arrows that knock helmets clean from the hands of nearby guards, silencing the room instantly. Satisfied, Codes welcomes them to dine with the royal court and finally explains why they were summoned. Thrace is collapsing into civil war. A brutal warlord named Rhesus has been ravaging the land, leaving burned villages and massacred civilians behind him. Rumors claim he commands terrifying centaur warriors, making his army seem almost supernatural. Every day, more refugees arrive at the capital seeking protection. Codes admits that his own military has been devastated by the conflict. Most of his trained soldiers are already dead, leaving him with little more than frightened farmers carrying shields. Both Codes and Erginia plead with Hercules to help restore peace before the kingdom is destroyed entirely. Listening to their desperation and seeing the suffering outside the palace walls, Hercules finally agrees to take the job. The next morning, training begins immediately. Hercules and his companions attempt to transform terrified peasants into real soldiers. Their first task is teaching the men how to hold a proper shield wall. The results are disastrous. The formation collapses almost instantly, exposing just how unprepared the army truly is. Later that day, Hercules meets privately with Hercules once more. The king reveals new intelligence gathered from a scout named Phineas. According to the report, Rhesus plans to attack the Bessi tribe in central Thrace within 6 days. Hercules sees this as their best opportunity. If they march now, they may be able to intercept the warlord before he advances deeper into the kingdom and leaves even more destruction behind him. Hercules immediately objects to Hercules' strategy. In his eyes, marching so soon is reckless. The men barely know how to hold formation, let alone survive a real battlefield. He warns the king that rushing into combat with unprepared farmers will end in disaster. Hercules refuses to reconsider. The king insists there's no time left to wait and orders everyone to prepare for departure at dawn. That night, while moving through the camp, Hercules notices General Siticles bothering Atalanta once again. The Amazon quickly makes it clear she has no interest in his attention, and Hercules steps in long enough for the arrogant general to back away. A short while later, Hercules spots young Areus sneaking through the camp in secret. Curious, the boy has wandered too close to Tydeus, who lies asleep while chained beside a chariot like some dangerous beast. When Areus gets near him, Tydeus suddenly lashes out in his sleep, nearly attacking the child before Hercules intervenes and pulls him away. As they walk together through the camp, Hercules explains the truth about Tydeus. The warrior was raised by war itself. When Hercules first found him years ago, he was barely human anymore, more savage animal than man. Somewhere in his past, Tydeus witnessed something so horrifying it shattered him completely. Since then, he has never spoken a single word. Every night, the trauma returns in his sleep, turning him violent and uncontrollable. Even so, Hercules trusts him more than almost anyone alive, calling him the most loyal fighter at his side. Eventually, Hercules brings Areus back to his mother. Erginia is tending to wounded civilians inside a crowded hospice. With so many physicians killed during the war, she taught herself medicine so she could help care for the injured. Before leaving, Hercules quietly hands Areus a tooth from the Nemean lion as a gift. The moment carries a hidden sadness, as though the keepsake had originally been meant for the children Hercules lost long ago. Morning arrives and the army prepares to march toward Bessi territory. As the soldiers gather, Hercules discovers Iolaus hiding among the troops, determined to join the battle himself. Hercules quickly reminds him that his strength lies in storytelling, not warfare, and orders him to remain near Cody's chariot instead of charging into combat. The army finally reaches the Bessi village, only to find absolute devastation. Rhesus has already arrived before them. The settlement has been completely destroyed, with corpses scattered across the land in horrifying numbers. The gruesome scene perfectly matches the battlefield from Amphiaraus' prophecy, a sea of bodies stretching as far as the eye can see. But something about the massacre feels wrong. Some of the corpses are clearly days old, already decaying beneath the sun. Others look freshly killed. Before anyone can fully process it, those fresh bodies suddenly rise from the ground and attack. It was an ambush from the beginning. Believing the Bessi tribe now serves Rhesus, Hercules immediately orders the soldiers to form a shield wall around Codes, while he and his companions engage the attackers directly. During the chaos, the tribal leader steps forward and challenges Hercules face to face. In that moment, Hercules quietly snaps the sharpened tip off one of Atalanta's arrows. Then, as the leader charges him, Hercules drives the broken piece straight into the man's forehead with such speed that it appears he killed him with a single punch. Iolaus instantly recognizes the opportunity. The storyteller loudly exaggerates the moment for the soldiers watching nearby, making it sound as though Hercules possesses godlike strength. The army becomes electrified with belief, convinced the gods themselves are fighting beside them. The battle erupts in full force. Hercules and his team carve through wave after wave of tribesmen, but the enemy numbers are overwhelming. Eventually, the shield wall begins to collapse under the pressure. Thinking quickly, Hercules and Amphiaraus race for their chariots. The two warriors begin circling the battlefield at full speed, smashing into enemy fighters and creating space around the trapped soldiers. Bodies are hurled aside beneath the pounding wheels as the tribesmen struggle to regroup. Using that opening, the remaining Thracian troops launch a desperate counterattack. The tribesmen finally realize the battle is lost and retreat into the wilderness. Yet one thing becomes immediately clear. Rhesus himself was never there. Far in the distance, a strange figure can briefly be seen observing the battlefield before disappearing from sight. Afterward, Hercules confronts Codes directly. He tells the king the slaughter was just as much his fault as Rhesus, because he ignored every warning about the army not being ready for war. Codes reluctantly accepts the criticism and agrees to give Hercules more time to continue training the men properly. Elsewhere in the camp, Cydicles demands the execution of Phineas, blaming the scout for leading them into the trap. Before he can act, Autolycus steps in and stops him. He announces that he'll personally oversee scouting operations from now on, though he warns Phineas that a second mistake will not be forgiven. Soon after, Erginia arrives alongside healers to tend to the wounded. She secretly escorts Hercules into his private tent, so nobody sees that the legendary warrior is bleeding heavily from his injuries, like any ordinary man. Once she leaves him alone to rest, Hercules falls into a disturbing dream. He sees the lifeless bodies of his wife and children again. Blood covers his hands. Standing nearby is King Eurystheus, condemning him not to death, but to exile, forcing him to live forever with the belief that he murdered his own family. Hercules suddenly wakes from the nightmare after hearing children laughing somewhere outside. Drawn into the nearby forest, he follows the sound until he stumbles upon a horrifying vision. Among piles of dead tribesmen lie the corpses of his wife and children once again. Feeding on them is Cerberus, a monstrous three-headed beast. Hercules prepares to attack, but suddenly Tydeus grabs him from behind and snaps him back to reality. The monster vanishes instantly, revealing that Hercules had been hallucinating the entire encounter. The following morning, Amphiaraus immediately understands what happened. It's clearly not the first time Hercules has suffered these visions. The seer tells him that peace will only come once he faces this final labor and conquers the beast haunting his soul. But Hercules fears something far worse, that he's slowly losing his mind. While Hercules and Amphiaraus speak privately, Erginia approaches the rest of the mercenary group, hoping to uncover the truth behind the legends surrounding Hercules. What she hears surprises her. The companions admit that no one truly knows what happened the night Hercules' family died. They only know they discovered him standing alone among the bodies, with no memory of the massacre itself. They explain that Hercules gathered each of them over time, rescuing or accepting them when nobody else would. He showed compassion to broken people, earning absolute loyalty in return. As his reputation grew, the stories around him became larger than life. Since his feats already seemed impossible for a normal man, people naturally began believing he was divine. Rather than deny the myths, the group simply leaned into them because the legends brought them work and fear earned survival. In truth, they suspect Hercules may have suffered from blood rage, a condition known to drive warriors into uncontrollable madness. From that point onward, training becomes merciless. Hercules and his companions reshape Codes' frightened farmers into disciplined soldiers. They equip them with armor modeled after Hercules' own gear and train them relentlessly in every form of combat imaginable: spear fighting, archery, swordsmanship, hand-to-hand combat, and battlefield formations. Over time, the transformation becomes undeniable. Eventually, the soldiers form a shield wall so strong that even Tydeus himself cannot break through it. Throughout the intense training sessions, one person continues practicing in secret. Hidden away from the others, Iolaus quietly mimics the soldiers' drills whenever nobody is watching. Though Hercules dismissed him as only a storyteller, the young man clearly wants to become something more. One afternoon, Phineas returns to camp carrying urgent news. According to his scouts, Rhesus and his forces have gathered near Mount Astygius. Rumors once again speak of centaurs riding with the warlord's army, and Hercules decides this is the perfect opportunity to strike before the enemy pushes deeper into Thrace. The location presents serious risks. The thick forests surrounding the mountain could slow their chariots and ruin one of their greatest advantages in battle. Even so, Hercules claims he already has a strategy prepared. As the army makes final preparations, Amphiaraus delivers another grim revelation. He admits he cannot foresee whether they'll win the coming battle, but there is one thing he knows with absolute certainty. Within a week, he will die. Several days later, the Thracian army marches toward Mount Astygius fully prepared for war. Yet when they arrive, something feels wrong immediately. There's no enemy camp, no fires, no soldiers. The mountain appears completely abandoned. Then in the distance, movement emerges across the horizon. Rhesus' army finally appears. As the riders advance closer, the terrifying truth behind the centaurs is revealed. The illusion was carefully crafted from the start. By riding in formation against the sunlight, mounted soldiers created the appearance of half-man, half-horse monsters from afar. The legendary centaur army never existed. Soon afterward, Rhesus himself rides forward to negotiate. Standing beside him is Phineas, exposing the scout as a traitor who has secretly worked for the enemy all along. Rhesus offers Hercules one final chance to surrender peacefully. The king refuses without hesitation. War begins. Hercules' forces lock together into their now perfected shield wall, while the outer flanks spread apart exactly as Hercules instructed. But before the enemy can fully advance, the first strike comes from somewhere unexpected. Suddenly, Atalanta and her archers burst from the forest aboard chariots, launching a surprise attack from the sides. Arrows rain down across the battlefield before Rhesus' army can properly react. Moments later, flaming arrows ignite the sky. Seeing death seemingly descending toward him, Amphiaraus calmly spreads his arms and prepares to meet his fate. Yet against all odds, not one arrow touches him. The battle drags on brutally. Although Rhesus commands larger numbers, Hercules' disciplined formations slowly begin overpowering the enemy forces. The farmers who once struggled to hold shields now fight like hardened soldiers. Eventually, Rhesus' army starts breaking apart. Men flee in panic across the battlefield, but Rhesus himself refuses to retreat. Instead, he rides directly toward Hercules and challenges him personally. The duel ends almost instantly. With terrifying strength, Hercules grabs hold of the charging horse and violently flips both rider and beast onto the ground in a single movement, completely overpowering the warlord before the watching armies. Some time later, the victorious army returns to the palace with Rhesus dragged behind them in chains. The city erupts into celebration. Hercules publicly humiliates the captured warlord before the crowds, treating him less like a defeated enemy and more like an animal on display. Despite everything, Hercules feels sympathy for the broken man and quietly helps him continue walking whenever he stumbles. As they move together through the city, Rhesus whispers a shocking truth. Hercules, not Rhesus, was responsible for burning the villages. According to him, the entire war was built on lies. That evening, a massive banquet is held to celebrate victory. Rhesus is chained between towering columns inside the hall, so the guests can stare at him like a trophy. Princess Erginia attempts to offer him water, but Hercules cruelly forbids it. The celebration soon transforms into something even larger. Now that Thrace has been united under one ruler, Hercules prepares to crown himself king over the entire land. But as the ceremony unfolds, Rhesus continues shouting accusations against him. The tension becomes impossible for Erginia to hide. When she quietly leaves the banquet hall, Hercules grows suspicious and follows after her. Away from the others, he demands to know the truth. Finally, Erginia breaks. Rhesus was telling the truth all along. Hercules poisoned her husband, the rightful king of Thrace, in order to seize power for himself. The war that followed was nothing more than a path toward building his own empire. Hercules asks why she remained silent for so long. Erginia tearfully admits she never supported her father's actions. She obeyed only because Hercules threatened to murder her son if she ever turned against him. Desperate now, she begs Hercules to take Ares away when he leaves Thrace. But before he can answer properly, they are interrupted by General Cytocles, who informs Hercules that Hercules wishes to see him immediately. Hercules wastes no time confronting the king. He openly accuses Hercules of betrayal and manipulation. Hercules, however, finds the outrage amusing. To him, mercenaries are men who kill for gold without question, so hearing Hercules suddenly speak about morality sounds hypocritical. The king openly admits his ambition. He wants to build an empire. Seeing Hercules' value as both a warrior and symbol, Hercules offers him command of his growing army, but Hercules refuses immediately. With negotiations over, Hercules pays the mercenaries what they were promised and orders them to leave Thrace at once. Outside near the chariots, Hercules hands his share of the gold to Autolycus. He explains that he intends to stay behind and stop Hercules, even if it means certain death. He tells the others they are free to leave and finally enjoy peaceful lives with their reward. But Atalanta quickly reminds him of something important. They never stayed because they owed him a debt. They stayed because they became a family. One by one, the group chooses to remain beside Hercules, everyone except Autolycus. Calling the rest of them completely insane, the thief rides away with all the gold while the others prepare for what may be their final battle. Under the cover of darkness, Hercules and his companions sneak back into the palace with ease. But the moment they enter, they realize they walked directly into another trap. General Cytocles is already waiting for them with armed soldiers surrounding every exit. Forced at spear point, the group drops their weapons. Cytocles then reveals another betrayal. He informs Hercules that he overheard Erginia conspiring with Hercules to take Ares away from the kingdom. Furious, Hercules immediately has Erginia arrested. As soldiers drag her away, Ares desperately runs toward Hercules for protection. During the struggle, the boy secretly slips the lion's tooth back into Hercules' hand before Hercules violently yanks him backward by the hair. Hercules tries to save the child, but he's overwhelmed and knocked unconscious. Hours later, he slowly regains consciousness while chained against a stone wall. Directly in front of him stands Cerberus. Or at least that's what his mind believes at first. As his blurred vision clears, the monstrous three-headed beast slowly transforms into reality. They are not monsters, they are three wolves, and Hercules immediately recognizes them. The wolves circling Hercules suddenly trigger a buried memory deep inside his mind. He knows them. They belong to King Eurystheus. Moments later, the ruler himself steps into the chamber alongside Hercules, revealing the truth behind everything. The two kings have secretly been allies from the very beginning, working together in pursuit of absolute control over all of Greece. As Hercules stares at the beasts and sees his companions imprisoned in cages around him, the final pieces of his shattered memory finally return. Cerberus was never real. The monster haunting his visions for years had always been an illusion created by trauma. On the night his family died, it wasn't some mythical beast that slaughtered them. It was these wolves. Eurystheus had drugged Hercules' drink beforehand, leaving him too weak and disoriented to protect the people he loved. Forced to watch helplessly through blurred senses, his mind twisted the horror into the image of a monstrous creature. Eurystheus calmly admits everything. He confesses that Hercules had become too beloved among the people. Crowds praised the warrior louder than they praised their own king, and Eurystheus feared that one day the legend of Hercules would eclipse his authority completely. To him, Hercules was dangerous precisely because he desired nothing. Men driven by greed or ambition could be controlled, but someone who could not be bribed or manipulated represented a threat no king could tolerate. Nearby, Cody's orders Erginia dragged from her cage for execution. Helplessly chained to the wall, Hercules can only watch as soldiers force her toward the block. Rage and frustration consume him, but for a moment he still feels powerless. Then Amphiaraus speaks. The seer reminds Hercules that every one of them believes in him, and that maybe, for once, Hercules should believe in himself too. Something inside him finally breaks free. Summoning every ounce of his strength, Hercules tears the chains straight out of the stone wall itself and charges forward to save Erginia. Panic erupts instantly. Codes, Eurystheus, and the guards retreat from the chamber, while the wolves are unleashed to finish Hercules off. At the same time, Erginia grabs the execution axe meant for her death and uses it to smash open the prison cages. The battle with the wolves is savage. The beasts tear into Hercules repeatedly, ripping flesh from his arms and shoulders as they drive him across the dungeon floor, but Hercules refuses to fall. One after another, he overpowers the animals with brutal force, hurling them aside despite his wounds. Finally, he kills the last wolf by driving the Nemean lion tooth directly into it. At last, his final labor is complete. The truth has been faced. The monster is dead. With the cages opened, the mercenary band arms themselves using abandoned weapons from fallen guards. Hercules then displays his monstrous strength once again by lifting an enormous iron gate high enough for everyone to escape the dungeon. They storm upward through the palace corridors, fighting through wave after wave of soldiers attempting to stop them. During the chaos, a flaming spear suddenly flies toward the group. Seeing death racing toward him, Amphiaraus calmly opens his arms once more, convinced his destined moment has finally arrived. But before the weapon can strike, Hercules catches it out of the air and immediately drives it back into one of the attacking soldiers, saving his friend yet again. While the others hold off the guards, Hercules hunts down Eurystheus. Cornered and terrified, the king desperately tries justifying his crimes. He blames Codes. He claims he was manipulated. He even attempts to command Hercules as his ruler and offers him wealth in exchange for mercy. None of it matters anymore. Hercules grabs Eurystheus by the throat, drags him toward the throne, and throws him onto it before plunging the king's own dagger into his body. At long last, vengeance is complete. For the first time in years, Hercules feels the possibility of peace waiting beyond the violence, but the moment doesn't last. A whip suddenly tightens around his neck from behind. Siticles. The general violently yanks Hercules to the floor and prepares to execute him right there. Before he can strike the killing blow, however, another figure appears behind him, Iolaus. The young storyteller drives a blade into Siticles from behind, saving Hercules' life. After years of treating him like a child, Hercules finally looks at his nephew differently. For the first time ever, he calls Iolaus a warrior. Rejoining the others, they discover the group has already freed Rhesus as well. Together, they escape the palace, only to stop dead in their tracks outside. Codes is waiting. And this time he stands surrounded by his full army. Worse still, Ares is being held hostage by one of the soldiers. Codes threatens to kill the boy immediately unless Hercules surrenders. Then suddenly, the hostage soldier collapses lifelessly. A knife protrudes from his body. Standing nearby with a grin is Autolycus, who has returned after abandoning the group earlier. Apparently, even he couldn't walk away from his family forever. Now freed, Arius runs toward Erginia as the final battle erupts around them. Titius immediately throws himself between the child and the incoming wave of arrows. The savage warrior tears through enemy archers with terrifying ferocity, slaughtering most of them before finally being overwhelmed himself. Arrow after arrow pierces his body. Meanwhile, the others overturn massive braziers, creating a burning wall of fire to temporarily hold Cody's forces back. Amid the chaos, Hercules kneels beside Titius and lifts his dying companion into his arms. Then something incredible happens. For the first and only time in his life, Titius speaks. With his final breath, he says a single word, Hercules. The warrior dies moments later. The flames separating them from Cody's army slowly begin to fade, and enemy soldiers charge forward once more. Realizing there's only one way to end the battle, Hercules turns toward an enormous statue of Hera towering nearby. With impossible strength, he shoves the gigantic monument from its foundation. The massive structure crashes downward in catastrophic fashion, exploding into countless stone fragments that crush soldiers beneath them. Cody's himself is thrown into the abyss below as the collapsing statue destroys everything in its path. Silence follows. Then, one by one, the surviving soldiers lower their weapons. They kneel before Hercules. Across the battlefield, voices begin chanting his name over and over, accepting him not merely as a warrior anymore, but as their new leader. 2014 was such an unusual year for Hollywood because somehow, multiple studios collectively decided the world urgently needed two separate Hercules films released within months of each other. Not years apart, literally the same year. It became one of those classic twin movie situations the industry keeps accidentally creating, where competing studios either unknowingly or very deliberately race toward the exact same concept at full speed. First came The Legend of Hercules, and honestly, that film arrived with the energy of a direct-to-streaming fantasy production, trying very hard to present itself as a major blockbuster event. Slow motion dominated nearly every sequence, the dialogue felt strangely lifeless, and poor Kellen Lutz looked as though he'd wandered into a luxury fragrance commercial that occasionally remembered it was supposed to contain large-scale battle scenes. By the time that film released, I think a lot of audiences, including me, were already exhausted by Hercules before the second Hercules movie had even reached theaters. Then suddenly here comes Hercules with Dwayne Johnson swinging an enormous club around in the trailers, and I remember thinking, all right, this has to be at least somewhat better. Right, but there was still hesitation, because this was during that particular era when Hollywood kept producing these massive mythology-driven action spectacles that all looked suspiciously interchangeable. Everything carried the same dusty color grading, armies charging through layers of CGI smoke, dramatic narration about destiny, and at least one shot of somebody screaming toward the sky while raising a sword overhead. You had film after film desperately trying to recreate the cultural impact of 300 without fully understanding why audiences connected with that movie in the first place. And then there was Brett Ratner directing this version, that didn't exactly inspire overwhelming confidence either. Ratner's career has always felt fascinatingly inconsistent to me because he's technically capable of keeping momentum moving on screen, yet very few of his films genuinely feel personal or visually distinctive. So going into Hercules, expectations honestly existed somewhere around, hopefully, this isn't actively embarrassing. That's why the reaction to the film ended up being surprisingly interesting. Because the dominant response wasn't, this is a masterpiece. Nobody was leaving theaters comparing it to Gladiator or talking about it as some genre-defining epic. The surprise was more that it was genuinely decent. Respectably decent, and after The Legend of Hercules, that almost felt shocking at the time. And I think part of that absolutely comes down to Dwayne Johnson himself. Even viewers who didn't particularly love the film usually acknowledged one thing very quickly. He at least looked convincing as Hercules. Physically, he made immediate sense in the role. He had the scale, the presence, the larger-than-life aura you need for a mythological warrior. Compared to the other Hercules adaptation released that year, this version instantly felt more credible before anyone had even spoken a line of dialogue. And honestly, audiences were already naturally inclined to root for him. This was before The Rock became fully overexposed as the ultra-safe franchise centerpiece he would later evolve into. Back then, there was still something genuinely entertaining about seeing him lead these enormous action productions, because Hollywood itself still seemed to be figuring out exactly what kind of movie star he was becoming. So when Hercules turned out to be a reasonably entertaining sword and sandals action film instead of a complete creative collapse, audiences responded almost with relief more than excitement. Like, oh, all right. This one is actually watchable, and strangely enough, that helped the film considerably. Expectations had dropped so low after the first Hercules movie that simple competence suddenly became a strength. The action carried more physical weight, the production design looked significantly more expensive, the supporting cast felt stronger. The film at least possessed an identity beyond slow-motion physiques and artificial epic dialogue. Now, to be clear, this wasn't some overlooked masterpiece hidden beneath unfair reviews. Even people defending the film usually admitted it was formulaic, overly familiar, and somewhat generic in places. But compared to the disaster many audiences expected, compared to the other Hercules movie released in 2014, this thing practically looked like Ben-Hur. And honestly, I still think that context matters when discussing the film today. Because if Hercules had released entirely on its own, without the strange shadow of another failed Hercules adaptation hanging over it, audiences probably would have judged it far more harshly. But arriving immediately after a movie many viewers actively disliked somehow elevated this version by comparison. Timing matters in Hollywood. Sometimes a film doesn't need to be extraordinary. Sometimes it simply needs to arrive directly after something weaker. The thing that genuinely surprised me most about Hercules wasn't the action sequences or even Dwayne Johnson. It was the fact that the film actually had an idea underneath everything, and not merely an action film gimmick either. I mean an actual thematic concept sitting beneath all the giant clubs and battlefield spectacle. Because this movie doesn't really approach Hercules the way most audiences grew up imagining him. If you were raised on mythology, classic fantasy films, or even the Disney interpretation, you probably walk into this expecting monsters, gods, supernatural powers, gigantic impossible creatures, and a full-scale mythological power fantasy. The trailers encouraged that expectation too. They emphasized the lion, the Hydra imagery, the massive boar, all the legendary iconography people instinctively associate with Hercules. But then the film begins, and very quickly you realize something unusual is happening. This version of Hercules may not actually be divine at all, and honestly, that's either the film's smartest creative decision or its greatest mistake, depending entirely on the kind of viewer you are. Because instead of presenting Hercules as a literal demigod throwing thunder-powered punches at monsters, the movie leans heavily into the idea that perhaps these stories became exaggerated over time. Maybe Hercules was simply an extraordinarily powerful warrior, surrounded by people who continuously transformed his victories into mythology. I actually really admire that concept. The film treats legends almost like ancient forms of public mythology building. Hercules travels with his nephew Iolaus, who essentially functions as a full-time storyteller, constantly retelling the 12 labors to audiences while adding additional dramatic embellishment every single time. You can almost feel the myth expanding in real time. Every retelling becomes larger, every enemy becomes more terrifying, every battle sounds increasingly impossible. And Hercules himself often seems subtly uncomfortable with the process. That's what I found genuinely compelling. The film keeps asking whether people need Hercules to be supernatural. Maybe the truth matters less than what the legend represents. People want symbols. They want larger-than-life heroes. They want someone who feels chosen by the gods because ordinary men often feel disappointing. There's actually a fascinating layer buried underneath all of this about how myths evolve over generations. Because when you really think about it, ancient mythology probably did function exactly like that. Stories passed from person to person, generation to generation, growing larger each time they were retold. One warrior eliminates a handful of attackers, and 50 years later, suddenly, he fought 100 men alone while Zeus himself watched from the heavens. The film taps into that idea constantly. Certain scenes deliberately present legendary events one way initially, then quietly imply there may have been a far more grounded explanation underneath them. And I genuinely appreciated that ambiguity. The movie never fully commits to saying Hercules is entirely fabricated, but it also never completely embraces full fantasy either. It keeps hovering within this fascinating middle space, where maybe he's simply a man, or maybe there truly is something divine hidden underneath all the bloodshed and storytelling. That tension honestly gives the film more personality than people often credit it for. At the same time, though, I completely understand why some viewers dislike this direction. Because if you walk into a movie called Hercules, there's a natural expectation that you're about to experience the Hercules, the monsters, the godlike strength, the impossible labors, the mythological chaos. And instead, the film spends a substantial portion of its runtime functioning more like a grounded mercenary war drama. That disconnect frustrated a lot of viewers. You can almost feel audiences waiting for the movie to fully embrace the mythology, only for the film to continuously pull back at the last possible moment. The creatures are mostly presented through stories, shadows, exaggerated retellings, or fragmented imagery rather than full fantasy spectacle. Even the famous labors feel less like supernatural adventures and more like reconstructed war legends passed down over time. And honestly, I think that's exactly why reactions to the film became so divided. Some viewers felt the grounded reinterpretation made Hercules more compelling. Others felt completely deprived of the larger mythological experience they expected. Personally, I think the concept itself is stronger than the execution, because there's a genuinely exceptional version of this movie hidden somewhere inside that idea, a version fully committed to exploring how myths are manufactured, how fear creates legends, how propaganda transforms warriors into gods. The film repeatedly brushes against those themes, but it never digs deeply enough into them. It still wants to function as a broad, crowd-pleasing blockbuster at the same time, so eventually it has to pivot back toward massive battle sequences and slow-motion action, imagery, before those more thoughtful ideas are allowed to fully settle. But I will absolutely give the film credit for this. At least it attempted something distinctive, and that matters, especially within a genre where so many mythology films simply throw CGI creatures onto the screen and call it world building. Hercules at least tried to reinterpret the character, instead of recycling the exact same, chosen demigod saves the world formula yet again. Whether it completely succeeds is debatable. But the ambition itself makes the film more memorable than many people expected going in. And let's be honest for a second, the biggest reason most audiences watched Hercules in the first place was Dwayne Johnson. Not the director, not the mythology angle, not even the story. It was the image of The Rock holding an enormous club while looking like he could physically lift an entire village. And honestly, that casting choice made immediate sense. Because physically, this is probably one of the most instinctive casting decisions Hollywood has ever made. You look at Dwayne Johnson and immediately think, yes, all right. That man could absolutely play Hercules. There's no real convincing required. The scale, the shoulders, the voice, the sheer screen presence, he walks into the film already feeling mythological before he even delivers a line of dialogue. And I think that helped the movie enormously, because audiences were willing to believe in him almost instantly. Now, performance-wise, this role is interesting because it exists in this unusual middle ground where Johnson is very clearly carrying the film, but the movie itself still doesn't fully understand how to use him yet. This was before he completely transformed into the ultra-polished blockbuster machine version of himself. Back then, there was still a sense that Hollywood was experimenting with what kind of leading man he could ultimately become. Was he the next Arnold Schwarzenegger-style action icon? Was he primarily a comedy action star? Could he handle darker, dramatic material? Could he anchor large-scale fantasy? And Hercules feels like a film trying to test all of those possibilities simultaneously. The reality is, Johnson naturally possesses charisma. That's never really been the issue. Even people who dislike his films usually admit he remains watchable. He has that rare movie star quality where the camera simply responds well to him. He occupies space effortlessly. You believe people would follow him into battle. You understand why legends would emerge around someone like him, but the movie makes a slightly risky decision with the character itself. This version of Hercules is exhausted. He's quieter than audiences expect, more worn down, more serious. There's a constant sense of guilt surrounding him because of what happened to his family, and the film portrays him less like an invincible god and more like a man burdened by years of violence and reputation. Sometimes that works remarkably well. There are scenes where Johnson genuinely sells the exhaustion beneath the mythology. He feels like someone trapped inside stories other people keep telling about him. And honestly, I think that angle fits Johnson better than many people realize, because there's a strange overlap between the character and Johnson's real-world celebrity image. The Rock himself gradually became larger than life over the years, bigger than reality in some ways. So watching him portray a man crushed beneath the weight of his own legend oddly makes perfect sense. But at the same time, I do think the movie suppresses some of his strongest qualities. Johnson is naturally charming. He's funny. He becomes noticeably more relaxed whenever he's allowed to play off other performers. Some of the film's strongest moments happen when he's interacting with Ian McShane or Rufus Sewell, because you can feel him loosen up slightly. That's when his personality genuinely starts breaking through the grim warrior exterior. And honestly, I kind of wish the film trusted that side of him more, because there are stretches where Hercules becomes almost too stoic, too weighed down. The line delivery occasionally flattens during some of the heavier dramatic scenes. You can sense Johnson trying to carry emotional material the script hasn't fully earned yet. He's not bad here at all, not even remotely. But this is one of those performances where the presence matters more than the dialogue itself. And honestly, that's not necessarily criticism. Old-school action stars built entire careers on exactly that quality. Schwarzenegger wasn't carrying films through subtle emotional realism either. He carried them through physical charisma, confidence, and unmistakable screen identity. Johnson operates in a very similar way. Actually, the comparison to Arnold comes up constantly with this film, and I understand why. Both men possess that larger-than-life physicality that immediately transforms them into cinematic figures rather than ordinary actors. But I'd argue Johnson is actually more naturally expressive than Schwarzenegger was early in his career. The issue here isn't capability, it's material. Schwarzenegger eventually received iconic films specifically designed around his strengths. Hercules sometimes feels uncertain about what Johnson's strengths truly are. One moment the movie wants him to be this mythic tragic warrior carrying profound emotional trauma. The next moment it wants him launching 50 soldiers across a battlefield with a giant club like a comic book titan. And strangely enough, he almost makes both versions work simultaneously. That's the genuinely impressive part. Even viewers who disliked the film often admitted Johnson himself wasn't really the problem. In fact, he's probably the primary reason the movie remains watchable during some of its weaker stretches. When the story becomes formulaic or the CGI starts looking overly artificial, the film usually survives because Johnson still feels physically committed to the role. Also, and this may sound superficial, but in a role like this it genuinely matters. The man simply looks believable in action sequences. There's weight behind everything he does. When Hercules storms through a battlefield, Johnson sells impact. Some action stars feel choreographed. Johnson feels heavy, like every movement could genuinely shatter something on contact. Now, the wig. We do eventually have to address the wig. That hair and beard combination occasionally looks like it wandered in from an entirely different production. Sometimes he looks appropriately mythological, and other times he resembles someone who accidentally took a wrong turn on the way to an elaborate Viking convention. The film manages to get away with it most of the time because Johnson himself has enough presence to overpower the awkward styling. But yes, there are definitely moments where the hair becomes unintentionally distracting. Still, by the end of the film, I think Johnson accomplishes the single most important thing the movie required from him. He convinces you this man could become a legend. Not necessarily because he's delivering the greatest performance of his career, not because the screenplay gives him extraordinary dialogue, but because he understands how to carry mythic scale both physically and emotionally at the same time. You believe soldiers would fear him. You believe ordinary people would tell stories about him around fires. You believe someone would gradually exaggerate his victories until they evolved into mythology. And honestly, for a film like Hercules, that's probably the single most important thing the lead actor needed to accomplish. One idea Hercules keeps returning to, sometimes subtly, sometimes very directly, is the notion that Hercules matters more as a symbol than as an actual god. And honestly, I think that's the aspect of the movie people either deeply connect with or completely reject. Because traditionally, Hercules is supposed to be this towering mythological figure, son of Zeus, slayer of monsters. Essentially ancient Greece's equivalent of a superhero long before modern superheroes existed. He's designed to exist beyond ordinary humanity. That's the appeal. He isn't supposed to feel normal. But this film continuously pulls him back toward the ground. Not entirely. The movie never fully eliminates the possibility that there's something divine within him. It leaves just enough ambiguity lingering in the background to keep the legend alive. But most of the time, the film treats Hercules less like a literal demigod and more like a man people desperately need to believe in. And honestly, I find that fascinating. Because once you strip away the monsters and gods for a moment, what the movie is really exploring is reputation, image, storytelling, the way human beings transform warriors into myths because reality on its own often feels too ordinary. There's this constant feeling throughout the film that Hercules has almost lost ownership of his own identity. Everywhere he travels, people already know the stories. They've heard about the 12 labors, the lion, the hydra, the impossible victories. Half the world already views him as something supernatural before he even enters the room. And meanwhile, Hercules himself often feels strangely disconnected from all of it. I love that detail. There are moments where he almost seems uncomfortable hearing his own legend repeated back to him, especially whenever Iolaus begins dramatically narrating events like an ancient world strategist orchestrating the greatest reputation-building campaign in human history. And honestly, Rhys Ritchie's version of Iolaus becomes incredibly important because he represents how myths survive, not through truth, through repetition. That's what the film keeps hinting at over and over again. Stories become larger every time they're retold. A difficult battle transforms into an impossible one. A dangerous animal becomes a monstrous creature. A powerful warrior slowly becomes the son of a god because ordinary explanations eventually stop feeling satisfying. And the really fascinating part is, the movie quietly suggests people need that illusion. The soldiers need Hercules to feel supernatural because it gives them hope. Kingdoms need legends because legends inspire loyalty and fear simultaneously. Even his enemies react to the idea of Hercules before they react to the actual man standing in front of them. At a certain point, the myth becomes more powerful than reality itself. Honestly, that's one of the smartest themes anywhere in the movie, and I don't think the film receives enough credit for even attempting it. Especially for a large-scale studio action production that easily could have relied entirely on CGI creatures smashing through walls for 2 hours. Now, whether the movie explores this idea deeply enough, that's a separate conversation. Because I do think there's an even stronger version of this concept hidden beneath the surface. A version where the psychological weight of being treated like a god is pushed much further. Imagine a Hercules who genuinely no longer knows whether people love him or simply love the myth constructed around him. That could have been extraordinary. The film touches that idea repeatedly, but usually retreats before it becomes too emotionally heavy. Still, the theme is there, and strangely enough, it often makes the quieter moments more memorable than some of the massive battle sequences. There's something deeply human about watching a character trapped inside his own legend. Hercules isn't just fighting enemies throughout this movie, he's fighting expectations. Everybody around him has already decided what he's supposed to be: a god, a savior, a monster, a weapon. And he's constantly trying to live up to stories that probably stopped being accurate years ago. That's why I think the film works best whenever it questions mythology rather than simply recreating it. Some of my favorite moments are the scenes where the movie deliberately blurs the line between truth and exaggeration. It presents these massive legendary events in almost mythic terms, then quietly reveals there may have been a much more grounded reality underneath everything. Not because the film wants to destroy the legend, but because it's fascinated by how legends are created in the first place. That distinction matters. The movie isn't arguing that myths are meaningless. If anything, it argues the exact opposite. Myths become powerful precisely because people choose to believe in them. Hercules may or may not be divine, but the belief surrounding him changes the world regardless. Armies move because of him, kingdoms fear him, soldiers rally behind him. At that point, does it even matter whether Zeus is truly his father? That's the question quietly sitting underneath much of this film. And honestly, I think that's why some viewers gradually appreciated the movie more over time than they initially expected. Beneath all the blockbuster spectacle, there's this surprisingly thoughtful idea about how history transforms into legend and how human beings instinctively create heroes larger than reality itself. The frustrating part is that the movie only almost fully commits to those ideas. You can feel it hesitating. One foot planted in thoughtful myth revisionism, the other firmly planted in, we still need a massive battle sequence every 15 minutes. So occasionally, the more intelligent ideas get buried beneath spectacle before they're fully allowed to breathe. But even unfinished, the concept gives the movie identity. Without it, Hercules probably would have become just another generic sword and sandals action film from the 2010s. With it, the movie at least feels like it's reaching for something more interesting than straightforward mythological fan service. One of the smartest creative choices Hercules makes, and honestly one of the main reasons the film remains entertaining, even when the plot starts becoming formulaic, is making Hercules part of a team rather than treating him like a solitary god wandering through the world alone. Because if this movie had simply been 2 uninterrupted hours of Dwayne Johnson grunting while smashing people into walls with a club, I think the novelty would have faded very quickly. The mercenary crew gives the film personality. And strangely enough, it gives Hercules himself more humanity too. You start realizing fairly quickly that this interpretation of Hercules isn't really built around the idea of one unstoppable divine warrior. It's more of a warband film, a group of damaged, dangerous people who have fought together for so long they practically function like a family now. Not a healthy family, obviously. More the kind of family where everybody probably carries unresolved trauma and at least 3 criminal accusations spread across different kingdoms. But still, a family. And honestly, some of the film's best moments come from them, simply talking to each other between battles. Ian McShane absolutely steals the movie half the time, completely steals it. His character, Amphiaraus, could have become unbearable in somebody else's hands because the entire concept is essentially, this man constantly predicts his own death. That sounds exactly like the kind of gimmick that should stop being entertaining after 15 minutes. But McShane has this dry, effortless delivery where even the most absurd line somehow lands perfectly. He plays the character like a man who has become so comfortable with mortality that everything around him now feels mildly amusing. There's this exhausted sarcasm sitting underneath all the prophecy material that blends perfectly with the film's tone. And honestly, every time the film begins drifting too far into generic blockbuster territory, Ian McShane reappears and injects genuine personality back into it. Then there's Rufus Sewell, who I genuinely enjoyed here because he brings this sharp, cynical energy into the group dynamic. He feels like the kind of man who's witnessed enough warfare to stop romanticizing any of it years ago. A lot of the chemistry within the mercenary crew works because Sewell and McShane completely understand the type of film they're making. They never overplay the material. They simply settle naturally into the world. Axel Hennie as Tydeus is interesting too because the character barely speaks, yet physically he leaves a surprisingly strong impression. He's essentially treated like this half-feral warrior operating almost on instinct, and somehow it works. The film occasionally leans a little too heavily into the silent savage archetype with him, but Hennie commits fully enough that the character still stands out visually. And Ingrid Balso-Bertel honestly deserved even more material as Atalanta, because every time she enters an action sequence, the movie suddenly feels more energized. She has this commanding screen presence that cuts through the testosterone-heavy atmosphere extremely effectively. The screenplay never fully develops her character the way it probably should have, but she absolutely feels believable as part of this hardened mercenary unit. That's kind of the recurring pattern with most of the supporting cast, actually. They're memorable enough that you end up wishing the film gave them more depth. John Hurt, for example, is simply one of those performers who automatically adds gravity to scenes purely through presence alone. Even when the surrounding material isn't exceptional, he carries authority effortlessly. The same applies to Rebecca Ferguson. You can feel talented actors consistently trying to elevate fairly straightforward blockbuster material. Now, not everybody connected with the team equally. Some viewers found parts of the supporting cast underdeveloped or occasionally irritating, and honestly, I understand that criticism. A lot of these characters are built around extremely recognizable archetypes. The prophet, the thief, the silent brute, the storyteller, the warrior woman, they aren't exactly subtle creations. But I think the movie ultimately gets away with it because the actors have enough chemistry together. That's the key. You believe these people have history. You believe they've fought beside one another for years. There's this rough familiarity between them that feels lived in, even if the screenplay never spends huge amounts of time deeply developing every individual relationship. And strangely enough, that dynamic changes the entire feeling of the film. Without the team, Hercules probably becomes another generic, chosen hero saves the kingdom story. With the team, it occasionally starts feeling closer to Seven Samurai or The Magnificent Seven. Not nearly as layered as those films, obviously, but structurally you can absolutely feel that influence. A group of skilled fighters brought together for a dangerous mission, each contributing different strengths and personalities to the conflict. The movie works best whenever it remembers that. Because honestly, the supporting cast often provides the energy the central plot is missing. The actual story becomes fairly predictable at certain points. The antagonists aren't especially memorable. Some emotional moments feel rushed. But the group dynamic keeps the film moving because you genuinely enjoy spending time with these characters, even when they're essentially exchanging sarcastic remarks moments before neutralizing an army. And I think that's part of why the movie remains surprisingly watchable years later. Not because the writing is extraordinary, not because the story reinvents fantasy cinema, but because there's enough charm and chemistry moving between the cast members to hold the entire production together. You can tell some of these actors understood the movie didn't require Shakespearean intensity to succeed. It simply needed chemistry, momentum, and enough personality to make audiences want to follow this group into another battle. And for the most part, they absolutely accomplished that. One of the reasons Hercules ultimately becomes more watchable than many people expected is because the movie mostly understands the kind of experience it wants to deliver. And I say mostly because the tonal balance definitely wobbles at times, but at least the film is genuinely trying to entertain you. That sounds like a simple compliment, but honestly, a lot of mythology blockbusters from the 2010s completely forgot that aspect. They became so obsessed with appearing dark and epic and important that they turned exhausting after 30 minutes. Everybody delivered slow, dramatic speeches about destiny while staring at mountains through layers of CGI fog. Hercules doesn't completely avoid those tendencies, but it also carries this slightly self-aware energy underneath everything. It understands audiences came to watch Dwayne Johnson launch people through walls. The movie never fully pretends it's creating some deeply sophisticated historical masterpiece, and strangely enough, that awareness helps it considerably. There's a comic book rhythm running through the entire film. The action is oversized. The characters are broad, the battles are exaggerated, and the movie occasionally leans right up against camp without completely collapsing into parody. That balance is honestly more difficult to achieve than people realize. Because if you approach a movie about a giant warrior swinging a tree trunk through armies with complete seriousness, it starts becoming unintentionally amusing. But if you lean too heavily into comedy, suddenly the mythology loses all weight and the entire production turns into a spoof. Hercules awkwardly moves between those extremes sometimes, but not in a disastrous way. Certain scenes genuinely play like old-school adventure films where the entertainment comes from the sheer scale of everything. Massive battlefields, roaring armies, impossible displays of strength, dramatic speeches before combat. The movie fully embraces all of that. There's almost a Saturday afternoon fantasy energy hidden inside parts of the film. Then 5 minutes later, the movie suddenly wants to explore trauma, guilt, betrayal, and whether Hercules himself even believes in the myth surrounding him anymore. So the entire production is constantly shifting gears. Sometimes that tonal movement works surprisingly well, sometimes it absolutely does not. McShane honestly becomes essential to the tonal balance because he prevents the movie from drowning in its own seriousness. Every time things begin feeling too heavy or self-important, he cuts through the atmosphere with another dry remark or another casually delivered prophecy about his own death. Rufus Sewell helps too because he brings this sarcastic edge that constantly reminds you these characters are mercenaries, not sacred mythological icons delivering theatrical monologues. That humor matters. Without it, I think the movie becomes painfully rigid. Now, some viewers absolutely dislike the lighter tone, especially audiences hoping for a more grounded mythology epic in the style of Troy or something closer to Gladiator. And honestly, I understand that criticism because Hercules definitely has moments where the comedy weakens tension instead of enhancing it. There are scenes where the film feels uncertain, whether it wants you to laugh, cheer, or emotionally invest in what's happening. And honestly, sometimes the dialogue itself doesn't help. A few lines feel far too modern for the setting. There's even that infamous moment where Hercules casually drops the F word, and it lands with this bizarre energy, like somebody accidentally left a piece of a 2010s action comedy screenplay inside an ancient Greek fantasy epic. It's strange, not immersion-breaking strange, just noticeably distracting. But I think the movie survives those awkward tonal moments because the cast commits hard enough to the world that you're usually willing to go along with it. The actors never play everything purely as a joke. Even when the material becomes cheesy, most of them still commit fully to the reality of the scene. And yes, this movie absolutely embraces spectacle-driven excess sometimes. There are moments where Hercules storms through enemies with such exaggerated force that the film essentially transforms into live-action graphic novel panels. Soldiers are launched across battlefields. Massive wolves emerge from the chaos. Warriors roar dramatically before combat while the score erupts in the background. And honestly, I almost respect the film more for embracing that energy than if it had tried to transform itself into some relentlessly grim prestige fantasy. At least it feels alive. That matters because Hercules is fundamentally designed as spectacle-driven entertainment. This is not a film constructed for 2 uninterrupted hours of philosophical reflection. It's the kind of movie where you settle in with snacks and watch mythological chaos unfold on a massive scale. And honestly, I think the best way to enjoy it is understanding that very early. If you walk into the film demanding historical realism or emotionally devastating drama, the flaws become impossible to ignore. But if you approach it the way you'd approach an old-school adventure film, slightly uneven, oversized, occasionally ridiculous, but genuinely trying to entertain, it works significantly better. And honestly, I think that's exactly why reactions to the movie became so divided. Some viewers saw a generic blockbuster that never fully committed to either seriousness or fun. Others saw a surprisingly entertaining fantasy action film that understood how inherently absurd the premise already was and leaned into that absurdity just enough. Personally, I think the movie lands somewhere directly in the middle. It never becomes truly epic, but it also avoids collapsing into painfully self-important fantasy drama. It's too campy to function as great prestige fantasy, yet too serious to fully embrace chaotic comedy action energy. The tone constantly shifts between gritty mercenary warfare, mythological spectacle, and comic book adventure. Sometimes that inconsistency weakens the film. Other times, it strangely gives the movie personality. Because for all its flaws, Hercules rarely feels completely lifeless. Uneven, absolutely. Silly at times, definitely. But there's enough humor, momentum, and self-awareness mixed into the sword and sandals spectacle that the film stays entertaining, even when the screenplay itself begins running low on genuinely interesting ideas. The narrative structure in Hercules is one of those things where, the longer you think about it afterward, the more you realize you've seen versions of this exact story before, probably several times. But strangely enough, while I was actually watching it, I wasn't nearly as bored as I expected to be. And I think that's because the film understands momentum better than originality. The setup itself is extremely straightforward. Hercules and his mercenary crew travel from place to place, essentially selling their military services to whoever can afford them. Then they're recruited to help defend Thrace from a supposedly unstoppable enemy force, which leads into soldier training, battle preparation, political manipulation, betrayals, massive action sequences, and eventually the inevitable wait, are we actually fighting for the wrong side? Realization. You can practically feel the movie checking off fantasy action structure beats one by one, but to the film's credit, it usually keeps moving. And that matters enormously in a movie like this because if the pacing collapses, everything collapses with it. The plot itself honestly isn't strong enough to survive slow storytelling. So the movie compensates by keeping scenes relatively concise, constantly shifting locations, and moving characters toward the next conflict or revelation before the audience has too much time to overanalyze the structure underneath everything. And honestly, that approach mostly works. There's a certain cleanness to the narrative that I appreciated. The film never buries itself beneath endless subplots or overwhelming mythology exposition. It stays surprisingly focused. Hercules gets hired, the team trains soldiers, something begins feeling suspicious, loyalties shift, massive war follows, simple, sometimes almost too simple, admittedly. Because while the film flows well, it also becomes very predictable at certain points. There are twists you can see approaching from miles away. Certain characters practically radiate future betrayal, energy the moment they appear on screen. Even the emotional revelations often arrive exactly when you expect them to. The movie definitely carries that familiar, we've seen this before feeling hanging over it. You can also feel echoes of older films throughout the structure. There's a strong Seven Samurai, or the Magnificent Seven influence, underneath the whole group of elite warriors helping defend vulnerable people framework. Then the mythology war aesthetic gets layered over the top of that foundation. So structurally, the movie rarely surprises you. What surprised me more was which elements worked better than expected. For example, I actually think the second half of the film is noticeably stronger than the opening. The beginning has impressive imagery and interesting setup ideas, but there's a slight stiffness early on where the movie is still trying to determine its tone, its mythology angle, and exactly how seriously it wants audiences to take everything. Once the political manipulation and betrayal elements start entering the narrative, though, the movie becomes more energized. Suddenly, Hercules isn't just fighting monsters or anonymous enemies anymore. He's questioning the people around him, questioning the stories he's believed, questioning the role he plays within all this violence. That's where the story becomes more engaging, not necessarily deeper in a fully dramatic sense, but at least more emotionally invested in itself. The third act especially carries more momentum because the stakes finally become personal. Up until then, portions of the middle section can feel slightly repetitive. Travel somewhere, fight someone, train soldiers, repeat. The movie occasionally falls into that rhythm, where it begins resembling a sequence of connected battle missions rather than one steadily escalating narrative. And honestly, there is a stretch in the middle where the pacing drifts slightly, not disastrously, just enough that you begin noticing the formula underneath everything. A stronger screenplay probably would have used that section to develop the supporting cast more deeply or push harder into the mythology versus reality themes. Instead, the movie sometimes defaults back towards standard blockbuster mechanics because it understands another large-scale action sequence can temporarily distract from structural weaknesses. Still, I'll absolutely say this. The film does a respectable job maintaining narrative clarity. You always understand the objective. You always know where Hercules stands emotionally. You understand who the enemy is supposed to be, at least initially, and the movie never becomes confusing or needlessly complicated simply for the sake of appearing epic. That's actually something I appreciated even more on rewatch, because so many fantasy action movies overcomplicate themselves trying to feel grand and mythological. Hercules keeps the storytelling accessible almost the entire time. Now, whether that accessibility feels satisfying depends entirely on what you wanted from the movie. If you were hoping for some deeply layered reinvention of Greek mythology filled with intricate political storytelling and emotionally devastating character arcs, then no, this film probably isn't going to offer much in that department. The screenplay simply isn't operating on that level. But if you wanted a fast-moving fantasy war adventure built around a charismatic lead, an entertaining supporting team, and large-scale action sequences, the narrative structure mostly accomplishes exactly what it needs to accomplish. I also think the movie benefits enormously from its runtime. At around 90-something minutes, it never overstays its welcome. Honestly, if this had been stretched into a 2.5-hour epic filled with endless lore explanations and grim speeches about destiny, the whole thing probably would have collapsed under its own weight. The relatively tight pacing saves it from becoming exhausting. Although strangely enough, part of me also thinks the movie could have benefited from another 20 minutes in a completely different version of itself. Not for additional battles, more character material, because there are glimpses of a much richer story buried underneath this structure. Hercules struggling under the burden of mythology, the mercenary crew functioning like a fractured family, the manipulation of fear and propaganda, the uncertainty surrounding whether Hercules is truly divine or simply perceived as divine. Those are genuinely compelling ideas. The movie just keeps moving past them on its way toward the next large-scale battle sequence. And honestly, that's kind of the overall experience of the narrative as a whole. It's efficient, entertaining enough, easy to follow, occasionally genuinely engaging, but constantly stopping just short of becoming truly unforgettable. You can almost feel a stronger film hiding underneath the structure the entire time. Still, for a modern sword and sandals blockbuster, the fact that the story remains coherent, reasonably paced, and consistently watchable already places it above a surprising number of films from that era. What genuinely surprised me about Hercules is that underneath all the massive battles and oversized spectacle, the movie is actually attempting to explore heavier emotional territory. Not always successfully, admittedly, but the effort is clearly there. And honestly, I think that's part of why the film lingers in people's memories slightly longer than some of the more disposable fantasy blockbusters released during that period. Because beneath all the muscle and CGI dust, this is really a story about a man who no longer knows whether he deserves to be considered a hero at all. That's essentially the emotional center of the entire film. This version of Hercules isn't introduced as some triumphant mythological icon standing proudly on mountaintops feeling blessed by the gods. He already appears exhausted the moment we meet him. The fame exists. The stories exist. People already worship him like a legendary figure. But emotionally, he feels hollowed out. And much of that traces back to guilt. The movie continuously circles around the death of his wife and children and whether Hercules himself was responsible for it. That trauma hangs over nearly every serious scene in the film. Even when he's leading armies or tearing through enemies in battle, there's this lingering sense that he's trying to outrun something inside himself. I actually think Dwayne Johnson sells that aspect more effectively than people expected at the time. Not through deeply nuanced dramatic performance in the award season sense, but through physical presence. Hercules moves like someone carrying emotional weight constantly. Even when the film shifts fully into spectacle-driven entertainment, there's usually this sadness sitting underneath the character. And what I found especially interesting is how the movie contrasts that personal guilt with the public mythology surrounding him. Everybody else sees Hercules as this symbol of strength, bravery, destiny, masculinity, whatever they personally need him to represent. But Hercules himself often seems uncertain whether he deserves any of it. It's almost as though the legend became too large for the man underneath it. That theme appears constantly, especially in the way other people project meaning onto him. Soldiers want him to inspire them. Kingdoms want him to save them. His enemies fear him before even meeting him. The world has already decided Hercules is a hero, while Hercules himself spends most of the film wondering whether he's simply a violent mercenary who survived long enough to become famous. That tension gives the movie more emotional weight than I expected. And honestly, the friendship dynamic helps enormously too. because this interpretation of Hercules is never truly alone. His mercenary crew becomes this strange, broken family structure where loyalty matters more than mythology. These people know the man behind the stories. They've seen him fail. They've fought beside him. They joke with him, argue with him. Protect him, that human side of the relationships grounds the film. Without the team around him, Hercules probably becomes too distant as a character, but the camaraderie makes him feel approachable. Especially during the quieter moments, where the movie briefly stops trying to feel epic and simply allows the group to exist together naturally. I also appreciate that the film repeatedly returns to the idea of conscience. At the beginning, Hercules and his crew are essentially professional soldiers for hire. Gold first, morality second. They'll fight for whoever pays enough. But gradually, the movie starts questioning that lifestyle. There's this slow shift where Hercules realizes strength without purpose ultimately means very little. And yes, on paper that sounds like fairly standard blockbuster morality, but the film handles it more thoughtfully than I expected. Because Hercules isn't portrayed as some pure-hearted noble hero from the beginning. He's damaged, exhausted, cynical. He's spent years turning violence into survival. So when the story eventually forces him to choose between simply functioning as a weapon or actually standing for something meaningful, the decision carries more emotional weight than the typical hero discovers honor narrative arc. The movie also touches on destiny in a surprisingly interesting way. Not destiny in the magical prophecy sense exactly, but more in terms of identity. People constantly tell Hercules who he's supposed to be, son of Zeus. Hero, savior, monster, legend. And the film quietly asks whether identity is something people choose for themselves, or something history and expectation force onto them. There's actually a fairly melancholy undertone to that idea. Because Hercules never really seems free throughout most of the film. Even his fame feels like a prison. Everybody around him needs him to remain larger than life because the myth itself has become valuable. And I think that's why the movie works best emotionally whenever it focuses on humanity rather than spectacle. Not the giant armies, not the CGI creatures, not the slow-motion action poses. The moments that genuinely land are usually smaller. Hercules questioning himself, the crew standing together after battle, characters realizing they've been manipulated. Those brief scenes where the mythology falls away and you're left with exhausted people simply trying to survive violence, reputation, and history. Now, does the movie fully develop all these themes? Honestly, no. And that's probably the frustrating part. You can feel stronger emotional material trying to emerge through the blockbuster framework, but the film keeps interrupting itself with action sequences before those ideas are fully allowed to breathe. It touches guilt, trauma, brotherhood, identity, myth-making, and conscience, but rarely explores any of them deeply enough to become genuinely powerful. Still, I'd much rather watch a messy blockbuster reaching toward meaningful themes than a completely hollow one. And I think that's part of why Hercules surprised certain audiences. On the surface, it looks like another loud fantasy action movie from the 2010s, but underneath all that spectacle, there's at least an attempt to explore what it might actually feel like to become trapped inside your own legend. Not a god, not a flawless hero, just a man everybody else decided needed to become one. All right, now let's talk about the actual reason a massive percentage of viewers pressed play on Hercules in the first place. They wanted to watch Dwayne Johnson dismantle entire armies with an enormous club, and honestly, the movie absolutely understands that. Whatever issues Hercules has, and it definitely has several, the action sequences usually deliver enough brute force entertainment to keep the film energized. This isn't elegant action filmmaking. It's not carefully choreographed martial arts precision or grounded tactical realism. The movie aims for impact, weight, chaos. The kind of action where every punch feels like it should legally qualify as a minor natural disaster. And strangely enough, that's exactly what this film needed, because Hercules himself isn't supposed to fight like an ordinary warrior. He's essentially treated like a human siege weapon. When Johnson charges into battle, the movie wants audiences to feel the sheer physical absurdity of this man existing at all. Soldiers don't really fight him so much as get launched into entirely different regions of the battlefield. And there's one thing the film absolutely gets right: Hercules feels heavy. That sounds simple, but it matters enormously. A lot of blockbuster action eventually starts feeling weightless because characters move like CGI figures drifting through artificial green screen environments. But here, even when the visuals become exaggerated, Dwayne Johnson's physicality keeps the action grounded. When he swings the club, it feels destructive. When he crashes into enemies, bodies react like they've actually been hit by something enormous. The movie understands that audiences arrived expecting mythological excess, and it leans into that expectation pretty aggressively. And honestly, I respect the film for committing to it. The battle sequences themselves are massive, loud, dust-filled spectacles in the best possible way. Armies collide head-on, horses tear through formations, spears fly in every direction. Warriors scream dramatically while charging directly toward almost certain death. It operates very much within that exaggerated sword and sandals blockbuster tradition, where realism quietly exits the room after the first 20 minutes. But the film fully commits to spectacle. There's a graphic novel energy running through the action that honestly works better than some of the movie's more serious dramatic material. You can feel the comic book influence throughout certain fights. The poses, the slow-motion impacts, the oversized brutality of everything. At times, the movie almost feels suspended halfway between ancient mythology and a live-action fantasy comic panel. Now, is any of this especially original? Not even remotely. You can absolutely feel the influence of 300 all-over portions of this movie, especially in the way it stages armies, frames stylized violence, and builds heroic combat imagery. There are also traces of Conan, the barbarian energy, woven into the more savage battle sequences too. The difference is that those films possessed much stronger visual identities overall. Hercules occasionally feels like it's borrowing pieces from more distinctive action movies rather than fully developing a style of its own. Still, the action remains entertaining because of sheer momentum. The movie rarely pauses long enough for you to completely question how absurd some of this spectacle actually is. And trust me, portions of it are very absurd. Hercules tears through enemies with the kind of force that would realistically shatter every bone in a normal human body instantly. Entire groups of soldiers exist primarily to demonstrate how terrifyingly powerful he is. And honestly, if the movie had tried to become more realistic, I think it would have been significantly worse. This is one of those films where excess becomes part of the entertainment value. The over-the-top nature of the combat eventually becomes almost charming because the movie never pretends Hercules is just an ordinary warrior. Even within its more grounded interpretation of mythology, the film still wants him to feel physically larger than life. Now, not every action sequence works equally well. There are definitely moments where the heavy CGI becomes distracting, especially during some of the larger battle scenes. Certain environments look overly artificial, and a few shots carry that hyper-processed digital look a lot of fantasy films from the early 2010s struggled with. Occasionally, the action becomes visually messy too, especially when the editing speeds up too aggressively. But overall, I'd still say the combat is one of the movie's stronger elements, mostly because it understands scale. The film does a respectable job making battles feel crowded and dangerous, rather than just empty CGI noise. There's dirt, smoke, screaming, shields colliding. You feel the physical chaos of warfare more than I expected. Not in the brutally grounded way of some historical epics, but enough to prevent the action from becoming completely cartoonish. Well, mostly cartoonish. And honestly, some of the strongest action moments don't even belong to Hercules himself. The mercenary crew receives several memorable sequences too, which helps the combat feel more varied. Atalanta moving through enemies with speed and precision, Tydeus fighting like a barely controlled animal, Amphiaraus casually walking into danger because he believes fate has already determined the exact moment of his death anyway. The supporting cast gives the action personality beyond simply large man strikes things. That matters enormously across the runtime. Because if every battle consisted only of Hercules smashing faceless soldiers for 2 uninterrupted hours, the spectacle probably would have started feeling repetitive. The group dynamic helps keep the combat engaging. Now, one criticism I do completely understand is that despite all the action, the movie never quite delivers a truly iconic battle sequence. There are plenty of solid fights, plenty of entertaining moments, but very few scenes that permanently burn themselves into your memory the way the best fantasy epics manage to. Part of that circles back to Brett Ratner's direction. The action is competent, large-scale, occasionally exciting, but rarely visionary. You never get the feeling you're watching a filmmaker reinvent what action can look like on-screen. The movie prioritizes reliable blockbuster entertainment over cinematic innovation. And honestly, that's probably perfectly fine for this specific film. Because at the end of the day, Hercules succeeds most whenever it embraces its identity as a giant popcorn fantasy action spectacle. The battles exist to make audiences cheer, not spend 40 minutes contemplating the psychological horrors of war afterward. And for the most part, they accomplish exactly what they need to accomplish. You watch Dwayne Johnson charge through an army carrying an enormous club. Soldiers fly in every direction. Ian McShane delivers another dry remark about death. the music erupts, and suddenly you realize you're enjoying yourself more than you expected to. And honestly, that's kind of the movie overall. Visually, Hercules is actually fascinating because it exists in this strange middle ground between genuinely impressive fantasy epic and early 2010s CGI overload. And depending on the specific scene, it can swing aggressively in either direction. There are moments in this film where it honestly looks really good, not masterpiece-level cinematography or anything close to that, but legitimately cinematic in ways many audiences didn't expect at the time. Especially after seeing The Legend of Hercules earlier that same year, which somehow looked strangely inexpensive despite trying very hard not to. This version at least feels like a genuine studio production with actual scale behind it. And the scale helps immediately. Massive landscapes, enormous battlefields, dust-covered armies moving across open terrain, giant stone structures, burning villages. You can feel the movie trying to recreate that old-school mythological adventure atmosphere, just filtered through contemporary blockbuster filmmaking. And honestly, certain shots genuinely work. There are moments where the film almost stumbles into that classic sword and sandals grandeur. Not quite gladiator levels, obviously, but you can absolutely feel the influence of older historical epics blended together with more modern fantasy aesthetics. Certain battle compositions especially carry that wide-scale cinematic feeling where you can tell the filmmakers wanted Hercules to appear mythic, even while the movie itself keeps questioning mythology. Dante Spinotti's cinematography does a tremendous amount of heavy lifting there. The film constantly tries to make Hercules feel visually larger than life, low-angle framing, silhouettes against smoke and fire. Massive crowd compositions, giant weapons dominating the frame. The camera is extremely aware that Dwayne Johnson's physical presence is one of the film's greatest assets, so it continuously emphasizes scale whenever possible. And honestly, yes, it works. Even people who disliked the movie often admitted it looked larger and more polished than expected. Now, at the same time, this film also feels deeply trapped inside the visual trends of the early 2010s. You can absolutely see the shadow of 300 hanging over parts of the aesthetic, the heavy digital grading, the slow-motion violence, the stylized battlefield imagery, the hyper-processed backgrounds. Hollywood spent years trying to recreate that visual style after 300 became such a cultural phenomenon, and Hercules definitely borrows pieces of it, sometimes effectively, sometimes less effectively. Because there are scenes where the CGI becomes extremely noticeable, especially early on during portions of the mythological imagery. The creatures, digital environments, and certain large-scale visual compositions occasionally look a little too clean and artificial. You can feel the green screen in places. The movie wants to feel ancient, weathered, and gritty, but some of the imagery ends up looking overly polished in that very specific 2014 blockbuster way. And honestly, the color palette doesn't always help. There's a tremendous amount of brown, gray, dust, smoke, mud-heavy lighting. Entire sequences sometimes blur together into one giant cloud of desaturated fantasy war imagery. It's not unattractive exactly, but it can become visually exhausting after a while because the film rarely allows itself brighter or more visually distinctive environments. That was such a dominant trend back then too. Every historical or fantasy blockbuster seemed terrified of color for some reason, as if the moment a movie looked too vibrant, audiences would stop taking it seriously. Still, I do think the production design deserves real credit. The armor, costumes, weapons, and environments usually feel convincing enough to pull you into the world. Hercules himself visually works extremely well most of the time, questionable wig aside, because the costume design completely understands what audiences want from this character. He looks like a mythological warrior. The lion skin imagery, the oversized club, the scars, the armor design, all of it immediately sells the legend. The supporting cast benefits from that too. Everybody looks appropriately weathered, battle-worn, and emotionally exhausted by years of violence. The movie avoids making the world feel overly glossy or sanitized, which helps preserve some roughness underneath the fantasy spectacle. I also appreciated that the film occasionally slows down long enough to let environments actually breathe. There are shots of mountains, villages, forests, and battlefields that genuinely look impressive. Some of the matte painting-inspired landscape work gives the movie a surprisingly old-school fantasy atmosphere at times. It isn't just constant close-ups and frantic shaky camera movement. The movie genuinely wants scale. And honestly, that ambition alone separates it from a lot of forgettable fantasy action films. Now visually, I think the film is strongest during the quieter, legend-building moments rather than the heavier CGI spectacle. Whenever the movie leans into atmosphere instead of digital chaos, it starts feeling much more immersive. fires burning at night, warriors silhouetted against massive landscapes. Hercules framed almost like an ancient painting, while stories about him are being retold. That material works extremely well. The problem is consistency, because immediately after a genuinely striking visual sequence, the film might abruptly cut to a scene where the CGI wolves look like they escaped from a video game cinematic. The highs and lows sometimes exist directly beside each other, and I think that inconsistency is ultimately why the movie never fully develops its own unforgettable visual identity. You can see influences everywhere. 300. Conan the Barbarian, older epics like Spartacus, even traces of graphic novel composition throughout the action scenes, but Hercules never completely transforms those inspirations into something uniquely its own. It's visually competent far more often than it is visionary. Still, there's enough craftsmanship here that the film rarely feels inexpensive, and that matters enormously for this genre. The world feels large enough, dangerous enough, and mythic enough that you can settle into it for a couple of hours without constantly being pulled out of the experience by weak production value. And honestly, for a mid-2010s mythology blockbuster starring Dwayne Johnson swinging a giant club through armies, that's already a fairly impressive achievement. The biggest gamble Hercules takes, and honestly the decision that divided audiences more than anything else, is the way it approaches mythology itself. Because this movie essentially walks up to one of the most famous mythological characters ever created and says, "What if most of it wasn't actually real?" That's a risky move, especially with Hercules. People don't walk into a Hercules movie expecting subtle historical reinterpretation. They expect monsters, gods, impossible tasks. Someone wrestling hydras and throwing bulls into the ocean, while Zeus watches dramatically from the heavens. That's the image permanently embedded into pop culture. And to be fair, the movie absolutely understands that expectation. The trailers leaned heavily into it too. They showed flashes of the Nemean lion, enormous creatures, mythological imagery, all this larger-than-life fantasy spectacle. It looked like audiences were about to receive full demigod chaos. Then the actual film arrives and essentially says, all right, but maybe those stories were exaggerated over time. You could practically feel some viewers becoming frustrated in real time. Because the movie spends a huge portion of its runtime dismantling mythology instead of fully embracing it. The legendary creatures often turn out to be misunderstandings, manipulated stories, or events distorted through retellings. Hercules himself may not even be divine. The movie continuously grounds things just enough to make audiences question everything they're watching. And honestly, I kind of admire the boldness of that decision. Even if I'm not entirely convinced the film fully succeeds with it, because there's something genuinely compelling about treating mythology almost like historical propaganda. The idea that legends are constructed through storytelling, fear, politics, and exaggeration rather than literal magic. That over time, a powerful warrior gradually becomes a demigod because ordinary reality eventually stops feeling exciting enough for people. That concept gives the movie identity. Without it, Hercules probably becomes just another generic fantasy action production where CGI monsters attack villages every 20 minutes. The grounded reinterpretation, at least, gives the story something intellectual to wrestle with, but at the same time, I completely understand why certain viewers felt deprived by it. Because there's a difference between subverting expectations and withholding the exact thing audiences came to see, and the movie absolutely drifts close to that line. You spend a huge amount of time waiting for the mythology to fully erupt onto the screen, waiting for the monsters, waiting for undeniable supernatural moments, waiting for Hercules to truly become Hercules in the mythological sense. But the film keeps stepping backward into realism right before it fully commits, sometimes cleverly, sometimes frustratingly. It almost feels like the movie is arguing with itself the entire time. One side wants to be a grounded mercenary war drama about how legends are manufactured. The other side wants giant mythological spectacle because, well, it's a Hercules movie. So the final result becomes this strange hybrid. There are moments where the realism angle genuinely works, especially whenever the film explores how stories evolve through fear, reputation, and retelling. Watching Hercules' legend become more powerful than the man himself is probably the smartest thematic thread running through the entire movie. But then there are other moments where you can feel the absence of mythology weakening the experience. Because let's be honest, part of the appeal of Hercules is the sheer insanity of the myths, the impossible labors, the creatures, the gods interfering in human affairs. The absurd scale of ancient mythology is part of what makes the character iconic. And the movie sometimes feels almost hesitant to fully embrace that. It wants the image of mythology more than mythology itself. That's an important distinction. You still get the lion's skin, the giant club, the stories about monsters. The larger-than-life reputation. Visually and structurally, the film absolutely borrows from Greek mythology, but emotionally, it often plays more like a grounded military fantasy than an actual mythological epic. That frustrated some viewers considerably, especially audiences expecting something closer to Hercules or older fantasy adventures, where Hercules genuinely felt superhuman from beginning to end. Instead, this version spends most of its runtime questioning whether the gods even matter at all. And strangely enough, I think the film becomes more interesting because of that debate, even when it doesn't fully succeed. Because the tension between mythology and reality creates uncertainty, the audience constantly tries to determine where the movie itself stands. Is Hercules truly extraordinary? Is there something divine hidden beneath all the exaggeration? Or are human beings simply desperate to believe that exceptional people must come from the gods? The film never gives a completely definitive answer. And honestly, I'm glad it doesn't. I think if the movie had fully committed to the idea that everything is fake, it would have become cynical and emotionally hollow. But by leaving just enough ambiguity hanging over certain moments, the film keeps the legend alive. You never fully stop wondering whether maybe, just maybe, there actually is something supernatural beneath the stories after all. That uncertainty helps enormously. It prevents the film from feeling like a complete dismantling of mythology. Instead, it becomes more of an exploration of why mythology exists in the first place, why people create heroes, why stories become larger over time, why human beings transform warriors into gods. And honestly, those are far more interesting questions than I expected from a mid-2010s Dwayne Johnson action movie. The frustrating part is that the film only half commits to exploring those ideas deeply. Every time the themes begin becoming genuinely thoughtful, the movie usually pivots back toward another battle sequence or another major blockbuster spectacle moment. But still, the mythology versus reality angle gives Hercules a personality most generic fantasy films never even attempt to develop. Even when it stumbles, at least it's wrestling with an actual concept, instead of simply throwing CGI creatures at the screen and hoping audiences applaud because someone shouted "Zeus" loudly enough. Talking about Brett Ratner directing Hercules is actually kind of complicated because this movie somehow represents both his strengths and his limitations at exactly the same time. Because if you judge the film purely on functionality, Ratner honestly does a fairly solid job here. The movie moves efficiently. It's easy to follow. The action is usually clear. The pacing rarely completely falls apart. The battles feel large enough in scale. The cast seems comfortable within the material. Nothing about the production feels technically incompetent, but at the same time, almost nothing about it feels uniquely his either. And honestly, that's been the strange thing about Ratner's career for years. He's a competent studio filmmaker in the purest possible sense of that phrase. Give him recognizable stars, a substantial budget, a screenplay, and a release deadline, and he'll generally deliver something structurally watchable. But when people discuss truly great directors, they usually talk about identity, style, perspective, some kind of artistic fingerprint that makes a movie immediately recognizable as theirs. With Ratner, that becomes more difficult. You watch Hercules and you can feel influences coming from everywhere else. Pieces of 300. People were expecting another disaster. So when Hercules turned out to be competent, energetic, and occasionally genuinely entertaining, the reaction in certain circles became surprisingly positive, almost out of relief. Like, oh thank God, this one's actually watchable. And honestly, timing helped the film enormously. Because if this exact same movie had released in a completely different context, without the shadow of another failed Hercules adaptation hanging over it, I think audiences probably would have judged it much more harshly. Instead, the comparison immediately made it appear stronger. Now, the other major expectation issue comes from Dwayne Johnson himself. When audiences see The Rock playing Hercules, there's naturally an assumption that the movie is going to fully embrace giant-scale fantasy spectacle. That's essentially his blockbuster identity: massive physicality, charismatic larger-than-life heroism, crowd-pleasing action sequences designed around overwhelming force. And the movie does deliver some of that, but it also gives him a surprisingly restrained, emotionally burdened interpretation of Hercules compared to what many people expected. He feels more like an exhausted mercenary than a glowing mythological superhero. Some viewers appreciated that grounded approach. Others wanted him to go full unstoppable demigod chaos. And honestly, I understand both perspectives there too, because there's definitely a version of this movie where Johnson fully embraces mythical larger-than-life absurdity, and that honestly could have been incredibly entertaining. But there's also something genuinely compelling about watching him portray a man trapped underneath the weight of his own reputation. The movie simply never fully commits to either direction. And honestly, that's really the central expectation problem overall. Hercules constantly feels like two completely different films fighting each other. One movie wants grounded revisionist mythology. The other wants giant blockbuster fantasy spectacle, and the final product lands somewhere slightly awkwardly between the two. Now, personally, I think the best way to approach the film is with very specific expectations. Don't expect historical accuracy. Don't expect deep mythological authenticity. Don't expect prestige fantasy filmmaking. Don't expect emotional complexity on the level of a great drama. Instead, approach it like an old-school popcorn adventure film with modern blockbuster energy. A slightly messy, occasionally clever, action-heavy fantasy war movie carried primarily by charisma, atmosphere, and spectacle. Because once you meet the movie where it actually exists instead of where the trailers suggested it existed, it becomes much easier to enjoy. Not perfect, not groundbreaking, definitely not the definitive Hercules adaptation, but honestly, considerably more entertaining than many people expected once they adjusted to what the film was genuinely trying to be. The really interesting thing about Hercules is that almost nobody seems to completely agree on how good or bad it actually is. And honestly, I understand why. Because this is one of those movies where your enjoyment depends heavily on what you personally value in blockbuster filmmaking. If you care primarily about originality, layered writing, and unforgettable cinematic identity, the film probably feels frustratingly average. But if you value charisma, momentum, spectacle, and straightforward entertainment, there's a very good chance you walk away thinking, you know what, that was actually pretty entertaining. And the conversation surrounding the movie has always existed right in that gap. You can find people describing it as a surprisingly enjoyable fantasy action adventure, and directly beside them, someone else calling it a completely generic CGI-heavy studio product. And strangely enough, both sides usually make valid points, because the movie absolutely is generic sometimes. There's no avoiding that. The plot follows familiar structural beats. The villains are weak. The screenplay repeatedly brushes against stronger ideas than it fully commits to exploring. The emotional depth only extends so far. There are entire stretches where you can practically predict the next scene before it arrives. And visually, while the film definitely looks expensive, it also carries a tremendous amount of that early 2010s blockbuster aesthetic that hasn't aged perfectly. Heavy CGI, dust-filled color grading, epic slow-motion battlefield imagery, clearly influenced by 300 and other fantasy hits from that period. So I completely understand why some critics dismissed it as another forgettable studio production assembled from familiar ingredients. But at the same time, I also think some people underestimated how much basic entertainment value actually matters, because Hercules is very rarely boring, and honestly, that's important. There are plenty of technically better-written blockbusters that feel emotionally lifeless after 30 minutes. Hercules at least has energy. The cast feels engaged. Dwayne Johnson fully commits physically. Ian McShane is clearly enjoying himself. The battles carry momentum. The movie keeps moving forward. Even when it stumbles, it usually stumbles forward with enough force to remain entertaining. And honestly, that counts for something. A lot of viewers appreciated the film precisely because it never tried too aggressively to become prestige cinema. It understood that it was fundamentally a popcorn fantasy action movie and mostly embraced that identity. People walked in expecting total disaster after the legend of Hercules earlier that same year, and instead they received something reasonably entertaining with a charismatic lead and respectable production value. That alone created surprisingly positive reactions in certain circles. There's also the Dwayne Johnson factor. Even many negative reviews still admitted he was one of the strongest aspects of the movie. Not because the performance is deeply layered or emotionally groundbreaking, but because he fits the role physically and carries natural screen presence. The film survives many weaker writing moments because Johnson simply feels believable as this larger-than-life warrior. And I think audiences responded to that authenticity more than critics did, because there's a difference between great acting and great casting, and Johnson lands very strongly in the second category here. He looks like Hercules in a way that instantly sells the fantasy, even when the movie itself becomes uneven. Now, on the harsher side of the conversation, some viewers genuinely disliked how safe the film felt. That criticism appears constantly. The movie introduces genuinely compelling ideas, mythology as propaganda, legends constructed through storytelling, Hercules trapped beneath his own reputation, but then repeatedly pulls away from fully exploring them. So for certain viewers, the film became frustrating precisely because they could see flashes of a much smarter movie hiding underneath the blockbuster formula. And honestly, I think that criticism is completely fair too. Because Hercules often feels like it's one bold rewrite away from becoming genuinely excellent. The potential remains visible almost the entire time. The film has a strong cast, a compelling central concept, solid production value, and enough thematic material to support something richer. But it repeatedly chooses the safer route. More battles, more spectacle, less emotional risk. So depending on the viewer, that either becomes fun blockbuster entertainment or wasted potential. I've also noticed the movie ages differently depending on how people revisit it. When it first released, there was disappointment from audiences expecting a mythology-heavy epic. But years later, I think some viewers appreciate it more once that expectation gap disappears. Watching it now, fully aware that it's essentially a grounded fantasy war adventure rather than a pure mythological adaptation, makes the film easier to enjoy for what it actually is. And honestly, blockbuster culture itself has changed too. There's almost something refreshing now about a relatively contained fantasy action film that simply wants to entertain audiences for under 2 hours without establishing 12 cinematic universes and 6 future spin-offs. Hercules feels strangely straightforward by modern standards. Messy, absolutely. Uneven, definitely, but straightforward, and I think that simplicity helped certain viewers warm up to it over time. Now, obviously, there are still people who absolutely disliked the movie. Some critics felt the action lacked imagination. Others found the screenplay painfully cliché. Some viewers couldn't stand Brett Ratner's direction or believed the movie completely wasted its mythology premise. Again, understandable. This isn't one of those films where the criticism feels unfair. Most of the weaknesses are extremely visible, but I also think some audiences connected with the film because it never feels entirely cynical. Even when it becomes formulaic, there's still this genuine attempt to create a fun mythological adventure with themes about legend, identity, and reputation quietly sitting underneath the spectacle. The movie tries. And that effort shows. And honestly, in an era where certain blockbusters feel assembled by committee with absolutely no personality whatsoever, there's something strangely likable about a flawed movie that at least swings toward interesting ideas, while Dwayne Johnson demolishes armies with a giant club. So the overall conversation surrounding Hercules basically comes down to this. Is it a generic blockbuster with wasted potential? Yeah, absolutely. Is it also a surprisingly entertaining fantasy action movie carried by charisma, energy, and a few genuinely smart ideas? Honestly, yes, that too. So after everything, the mythology debates, the massive battle sequences, the surprisingly thoughtful concepts hidden underneath the blockbuster chaos, the uneven writing, the entertaining supporting cast, the strange tonal balancing act, where does Hercules actually land? Honestly, right in that strange middle space between better than it should have been and not as good as it could have been. And I think that's probably why the movie still gets discussed more than certain fantasy blockbusters from that era that were technically more polished but completely forgettable. Because Hercules at least has personality. A messy personality, definitely, but personality. This isn't one of those movies that feels entirely manufactured in a laboratory by executives trying to mathematically calculate audience reactions. You can actually feel different creative ideas competing inside the film. Sometimes that hurts it. Sometimes it makes it more interesting. There's absolutely a version of this movie that could have become genuinely great. I really believe that. The ingredients are all there. Dwayne Johnson is perfectly cast physically. The myth versus reality concept is genuinely compelling. The mercenary team dynamic works extremely well. Ian McShane is consistently entertaining. The action carries real physical weight. The production looks large enough in scale. The themes surrounding reputation, guilt, and storytelling are surprisingly strong for a film that could have easily become completely empty spectacle. But the movie never fully commits hard enough in any single direction. It's not mythological enough for viewers wanting full fantasy spectacle, not emotionally layered enough to become prestige drama, not visually groundbreaking enough to reinvent the genre, not strange enough to evolve into a true cult classic, not epic enough to stand beside the genuinely great Sword and Sandals films. It constantly stops just short of becoming unforgettable, and yet, I still kind of enjoy it, not in a hidden masterpiece sense. Definitely not that. But there's something strangely entertaining about a movie that understands its own strengths well enough to remain enjoyable, even while struggling with some of its larger ambitions. Because honestly, the film could have collapsed completely. A lot of mid-2010s fantasy action movies absolutely did. Studios were chasing the success of 300, trying to revive Sword and Sandals epics again, drowning everything in CGI dust and slow motion, and many of those productions became instantly disposable. Hercules survives mostly because of charisma. That's the word I keep returning to. Dwayne Johnson's charisma, Ian McShane's charisma, the chemistry within the mercenary crew. The movie's willingness to occasionally embrace ridiculous spectacle instead of pretending it's somehow above it. That stuff matters. There are technically better fantasy films that I remember far less clearly than this one because they lacked energy. No personality, no sense of fun. Hercules at least feels alive most of the time, even during its more generic stretches. And honestly, I think the movie has aged slightly better than expected because blockbuster filmmaking became so aggressively overcomplicated afterward. Watching Hercules now almost feels refreshing in a strange way. It's under 2 hours. The plot is easy to follow. There's no cinematic universe homework attached to it, no endless sequel setup dominating every scene. It's simply a self-contained fantasy action film trying to entertain audiences for one evening. And honestly, that simplicity helps it considerably. Now, obviously, the movie still has major flaws. The villains are weak. The screenplay repeatedly retreats from its most compelling ideas. The mythology angle frustrates viewers expecting a true Hercules epic. The CGI is inconsistent. The emotional depth only extends so far. And Brett Ratner's direction, while competent, never elevates the material into something visually iconic. Those criticisms are completely fair. But at the same time, I also think some viewers were overly harsh on the film simply because it wasn't the version of Hercules they personally wanted. If you accept the movie on its own terms, a graphic novel-inspired fantasy war adventure with grounded mythology elements and blockbuster energy, it becomes a significantly easier film to enjoy. Not amazing, just entertaining. And honestly, there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. Not every movie needs to redefine cinema. Sometimes a film simply needs a charismatic lead actor, an entertaining supporting crew, a few memorable battle sequences, and enough interesting ideas to keep your attention engaged between explosions. Hercules delivers that. Imperfectly, absolutely, but it delivers it. I also think Dwayne Johnson's performance became an important part of the movie's long-term identity overall. Even people who dislike the film usually admit he was strong casting. In retrospect, this feels like one of the earlier movies where Hollywood fully realized how effective Johnson could become as a large-scale blockbuster laid when the role properly matched his physical presence. And honestly, without him, I'm not convinced this movie works at all. He gives the film legitimacy, not dramatic prestige necessarily, but mythological physical credibility. You believe this man could become a legend. And for a movie like this, that's absolutely essential. So no, Hercules isn't a modern classic. It's not the definitive adaptation of Greek mythology. It's not the next Gladiator. It's not even the strongest fantasy action movie released during its own decade. But it's also nowhere near the disaster some people predicted when it was first announced. It's a flawed, entertaining, occasionally surprisingly thoughtful blockbuster, carried by charisma, spectacle, and a genuinely compelling central concept that never fully reaches its potential. And honestly, that's still considerably more than many mythology films ever managed to achieve.